most-watched court cases. The court has upheld birthright citizenship. You'll recall President Trump, when he resumed office, one of the first executive orders he signed was to try to revoke birthright citizenship for those who are here either temporarily or illegally. If they have a child here, that birthright citizenship would not be automatically applied. The Supreme Court said no, that's not the case, siding with the 14th Amendment that anybody born in the country is a citizen with limited exceptions. Now, the president's executive order had been blocked by several lower courts, so it never took effect as it's made its way up to the Supreme Court. You might remember President Trump even attended arguments in the case in the Supreme Court, a rarity to see a sitting U.S. president attending oral arguments at the U.S. Supreme Court. Joining us now to talk more about this is immigration attorney Michael Davis, who's a lawyer at Davis Immigration Lawyers in St. Louis Park. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Ryan.
Where did you expect? I mean, when this decision came out today with the Supreme Court siding with the 14th Amendment, saying that it's pretty clear, was this an expectation for you, or were you thinking that it might have gone different ways?
Well, it's hard to predict any outcome these days. We were predicting that the Supreme Court would uphold birthright citizenship. As far as I'm concerned now, I have not read the entire decision, which is almost 200 pages, but my biggest concern was that this should have been an easy 9-0 decision by the court. What I thought was most interesting was that it was really like a 5.5 to 3.5 split decision, and I was disappointed that there was not a unanimous court agreement on the overall issue.
Yeah, well, Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, said that children born of parents unlawfully or temporarily present in the United States satisfy both elements of the citizenship clause under the Constitution. They are citizens at birth. You mentioned that it wasn't unanimous. A dissenting opinion from Justice Samuel Alito said the 14th Amendment confers citizenship on only those children who, at birth, owe allegiance solely to this country. What does Justice Alito mean by that in that dissenting opinion? It's kind of hard to sort of parse the words out here, that it's citizenship only to children who owe allegiance solely to this country. What does he mean in that opinion?
Well, first of all, hard to know, and I haven't had a chance to read the dissenting opinion. I think whatever he says there is just legally incorrect, especially where the allegiance would be the allegiance of the child, not of the parent, regardless of the parent's immigration status or lack of status. So hard to know exactly what he means by those comments.
Yeah,
I just think they're legally wrong. They run contrary to both the Immigration and Nationality Act as enacted by Congress and by the Constitution as amended through the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, and that's why I thought that was really interesting. It's hard to know exactly what that means, but as you said, it's not a unanimous decision, a dissenting opinion here. And that was the reasoning put behind it, that children owe allegiance solely to this country, maybe referencing the fact that they're born to parents who are immigrants, whether temporary or not legal status. But that is sort of the mindset playing out in this, where again, the majority is saying, well, the Constitution is pretty clear. President Trump, in a social media post responding to this, called it something that it could easily make up for in Congress through legislation, and that no long and unwieldy constitutional amendment is necessary. So the president is saying that he can challenge this through Congress. Is that even possible? It seems like once the Supreme Court rules on a constitutional issue, that's sort of the end of the game.
I think that's correct what you just said, especially where 5 or at least 5 of the justices on the Supreme Court did rule, purely on the constitutionality of the birthright citizenship. The only one that did not was Justice Kavanaugh. So when we say that it was a 5.5 to 3.5 split vote, I believe that his decision was based on the reading of the statute as passed by Congress, at Section 1401 of the Immigration Act, which tells us, who's a citizen and what are the very, very narrow exceptions for those persons born here who would not automatically acquire citizenship by being born on U.S. soil.
So how much does this maybe affect somebody like you in immigration law? How many of these cases of children born here to those temporarily here or not legally here? I mean, how many times does that birthright citizenship become even an issue in a practice like yours, an immigration attorney?
Well, it's hard to say. It becomes a big issue, for example, when you've got children who want to petition for their parents to immigrate, or it creates a huge issue with the concern in the Twin Cities about Operation Metro Surge, who's here legally, who's not here legally. So imagine the same Operation Metro Surge that we just went through over the last several months here. Imagine now children who were born here in this country, have never lived anywhere else. Imagine those persons being picked up for potential deportation. So it's not just the one issue standing by itself. It's part of the whole package of initiatives by the administration that have really made life very problematic for our clients and for businesses that employ our clients and any of the stakeholders here who are concerned about current policies.
All right. Well, certainly a big question answered today by the U.S. Supreme Court in something that's been challenged here now for a couple of years. Birthright citizenship is enshrined in the Constitution. Appreciate taking time to join us today, Michael Davis, immigration attorney.